What's going on, guys? My name is Andrew. Welcome back to a brand new exciting vlog. Today's video is episode 3 in how to get the most out of your inexpensive camera gear, and today we're going to be talking about time lapses. Alright, so time lapses, what are they, when should you use them, and how do you actually do them? Those are the 3 main questions we're going to be going over in this video. And in the how to do them segment of this video, we're going to be talking about how to do day time lapses, night time lapses, motion blur time lapses, and moving time lapses. Now before I jump into this video, I do want to do a quick disclaimer because I'm by no means a professional. All the information I'm going to be relaying to you guys in this video I have learned either from YouTube or experience, so none of the information taught in this video is guaranteed to be perfectly professional or proper or right, but the techniques I'm going to be teaching you guys do work, and in the end that's really the only thing that actually matters. So first thing first, what is a time lapse? All a time lapse is a clip that is sped up a ton to show time passing extremely quickly. So don't be intimidated, literally everyone can do a time lapse. So the next question is when/why should you use a time lapse? There are really 2 main reasons to use a time lapse in your videos. The first way I personally use it is to do establishing shots. Let's say I've got 2 minutes of footage from one spot, and then I drive from one place to another, let's say from my house to a trampoline park. And instead of just telling the audience that I'm now at a trampoline park, what films are supposed to do is they're supposed to show rather than tell. So a good way to show that I'm now at a trampoline park would be to do a time lapse of the trampoline park itself. Now it's very clear where you are. Obviously it doesn't necessarily have to be a time lapse to be an establishing shot, but a time lapse definitely does add to the level of interest to the shot. The other reason why I would use a time lapse is to show time passing, and this is where it's probably used the most. Let's say I'm trying to learn how to do a new flip on the trampoline, and I want to show that I didn't learn this trick that quickly. It took me a long period of time, but I don't want to have just a really long clip of me trying this trick, and I don't want to have just a bunch of little clips showing me attempting the trick. A good solution to that problem would be a time lapse. Not only would it show that I've been trying this trick for a very long period of time, but once again it also adds a level of interest to your shot. So those are 2 scenarios when I'd usually use a time lapse. So now that we know what a time lapse is, when/why you should use a time lapse, how do you actually do a time lapse? In this video we're going to be going over 4 different types of time lapses. So let's talk about the first one, just your normal regular old daytime time lapse. There are actually 2 different ways to get a time lapse. You can either film a really long video and then speed it up in editing, or you can just take a bunch of individual pictures and piece them together at the end. The first is fairly self-explanatory. You're just going to want to set your camera facing the object that you want to time lapse. If you're using a DSLR, you're going to want to focus your shot but then turn off autofocus. Otherwise you get this really weird jittery effect in your time lapse. And then after you do that, all you have to do is hit the start recording button. If I'm taking a video time lapse, I usually only record about 10 minutes long, and generally that's enough time to get a fairly fast moving time lapse effect when you speed it up in editing. When I don't feel like going through the hassle of taking individual pictures, a lot of times I'll just use a video time lapse. Many people on YouTube, I'd almost say most people on YouTube, use this method to take their time lapses for their videos. The second method of taking a time lapse is a little bit more complicated, but that is when you take the individual pictures and then you string them up together in post. To do this, you're going to need what is called an intervalometer. What an intervalometer does is it allows you to set up your camera to take pictures consistently every few seconds or every few minutes or every few hours, whatever you want. You don't want to have to sit next to your camera and take a picture every 5 seconds or however long you want your time lapse to be going, because not only will that add shake to your time lapses, but it'll also just be a huge hassle. So what the intervalometer allows you to do is to say, I want the camera to take a picture every 5 seconds until I tell it to stop. It doesn't have to be 5 seconds, it can be whatever amount of time you want it to be. If you want everything in the time lapse to be moving super quickly and the clouds to be flying past, then you're only going to want to take 1 picture every 10 seconds, 15 seconds, even up to a minute or so. So there are 2 options to get an intervalometer. One, you can buy an external intervalometer off of Amazon or eBay. They're pretty cheap and they're super useful, but I personally don't have an external intervalometer. What I use for my Canon is a program called Magic Lantern, and Magic Lantern is the this download you can put onto your SD card, and then in that download you get a whole bunch of new settings for your camera, and one of those settings is an intervalometer. So when I use this particular SD card, I actually have an intervalometer built into my camera. That program is actually only available for Canon cameras, but look into the settings of your camera because you might actually have an intervalometer built in already. So those are the two methods you can use to take your average, normal, daytime time lapse. Now let's talk about night lapses, night time lapses. Now, unless you have a really good low light camera, which I'm gonna assume most of you guys probably don't, then you're gonna have to have an intervalometer to do a night time lapse. To get a night time lapse, you just do the exact same thing I told you guys to do, except you're gonna wanna make sure that you have an extremely long shutter speed. You guys know how there's 2 clicks when you take a picture. There's that What those 2 clicks are is the shutter opening and then the shutter closing. And during the amount of time between the shutter opening and the shutter closing is the amount of time that the camera allows light to come into your camera. So the more time between when the shutter opens and the shutter closes, the more light will come into your picture, and therefore the brighter your picture will be. So at night, to get a time lapse of the stars, you're going to need the amount of time between the shutter opening and the shutter closing to be really long. So what I do is I usually have about a 10-second shutter speed. So the camera will actually be taking one picture for about 10 seconds, and that'll usually allow enough light to come in for the camera to pick up the light of the stars. So let's say for a particular night I'm shooting on, it's pretty dark, so I'm gonna need a 15-second shutter. After that, I'm just gonna set my intervalometer to take a picture about every 20 seconds, and then you're good, and you're just gonna let your camera run until it's taken about 120 pictures, or however many you need, depending on how long you want the time lapse to be. Alright, the third type of time lapse we're gonna be talking about is the motion blur time lapse. A motion blur time lapse is like this one, where if you look closely, you can see the building, but you also see those little blurs going through the street. What those blurs are is they're actually cars. The reason why many people like the way this effect looks, if I saw a car moving really quickly, I wouldn't see one perfect crisp frame, I guess you could say. I'd see a motion blur of a car. So by having motion blur in your time lapses, it just makes it look a little bit more realistic and professional. Now, the way you get a motion blur in your time lapses is you just have a long shutter speed like we did for the night lapses. During the time that the shutter is open, anything that moves through the frame will be picked up by the camera. So at night you have pretty much no choice but to get some motion blur. But during the daytime, what you're going to want to do is take your aperture and bring it all the way up as high as it can be. And what that will do is make your image a lot darker. And to substitute for that darkness, you can make your shutter speed about a second long without overexposing the photo. Another thing you can do, the technique I personally use, is I just use an ND filter. And what an ND filter does is it's pretty much just sunglasses for your camera lens. It'll make the whole picture darker, so that once again you can make your shutter speed pretty slow. And by doing so, you'll be able to get motion blur, but you won't overexpose your photo. Alright, so the last type of time lapse we're going to be going over is the moving time lapse. One way to get a moving time lapse is to use a hyperlapse, but I've already made 2 tutorials on how to hyperlapse, so I'm not going to talk about those here. I'll just link them down below. The other method to get a moving time lapse is to use like a timer. Here's the egg timer that I used to use. It's super basic. It's made by Movo. I was never able to use my DSLR on this because it just couldn't handle the weight, but I could use like a GoPro or my phone. So right here, this time notch says 45 minutes, 270 degrees. That means the top of this platform will spin 270 degrees in the next 45 minutes. What that does is it allows for uniform motion of the camera to be spinning while everything else is moving extremely quickly. I personally love this effect. I think it looks really cool. But alright everyone, so that is what, when, and how to do a time lapse. Some of the topics I feel like I had to kind of rush through, and I wish I had more time to individually go through. But this video would be super long if I went into depth with each individual topic. If you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to comment down below, or a simple Google/YouTube search can usually solve your problem pretty well. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to give it a big thumbs up, but I think that's pretty much it. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. Peace.